The Kingkiller Chronicles is a trilogy, a 3-book series, although only 2 of those 3 books are out so far, and it's been about 10 years since the last book. So it could come out any day, or it might be a while. This series takes place over 3 days in real time, real book time, where a character, Kvothe, is talking about his past. He's telling somebody all about his past. Apparently he's kind of a legend. The first book is the first day of him telling his story. The second book is the second day of him telling his story. So we still haven't come to present day really in the tide of things for this particular trilogy. The author says that it's going to be a trilogy. I am beginning to believe that it'll actually be a trilogy just to start the series. The first 3 books will talk about the past, and then it's got to go somewhere from there. I have not read these books in some time, however. Andrea just finished them, so she's got a much more fresh perspective, and I've got the stale, I've had plenty of time to think about it perspective.
In our review, we're going to go over the 5 P's.
Which are?
Plot.
People.
Places.
Pacing.
I don't know what the last one is. Oh, prose. Okay.
Then we'll give an overall review of what we thought of the series so far. We're going to review both books, the first and the second. Not book 2.5, which she's currently reading, and I am going to reread because it was my favorite in the series. For book 1 on plot, I gave it a 9. It immediately grabbed me. It was an interesting premise. It pulled me in. I wanted to know who this innkeeper was, who he really was. It drops you pretty quickly to when he was a kid and all of the things that he went through. It's kind of a coming into adolescence and young adulthood story. And there's always a lot of character development for regular people in everybody's lives. Everybody develops quite a bit then. So there was a lot of momentum there. And it drew me in. It was very interesting. I enjoyed the first book for plot thoroughly.
I gave it an 8 for the first book and a 9 for the second book.
I didn't tell you what I gave it the second book. Second book, I gave it an 8.5. Because, listen, second books in a trilogy are usually like middle children. It's not fair to expect as much from them. Middle books of a trilogy just usually suffer from the fact that they're the middle of the story. They don't have the big conclusion. They don't have the amazing introduction. They're stuck carrying a lot of the weight, but not making a lot of headway. There's a few examples of that not being the case. Lord of the Rings, Two Towers, Empire Strikes Back. There are some very good second parts to trilogies.
I liked the second book better. I don't know what it was, but I got introduced to some interesting characters that I really liked and got to know them more in the second book. And the story continued. The first one, I just eased into it more, I guess, a little bit. It took me longer to get into it. And so that's why I give it like a 7 and the second book an 8.
Might have taken a little bit just to get into his prose.
And that's what I wanted to talk about later.
For the Wise Man's Fear, one of the critiques I kind of have for that plot is that it felt like a collection of short stories. It didn't have a really strong through line. It was almost like we were checking boxes on the legend of Kvothe. Like, all right. He's got this really cool sword. He's got this really cool cloak. All right, he did all these cool things that have built his legend up. It's like we were just checkbox, which doesn't make for a good overall arc. It just seemed, like I said, one short story after another.
But I think it brought us more clues for what's happened in the present, like what's going on in the present time. We talked about the sword and some other things that we had no clue about in the first book, but the second book kind of brought those out, the stories of those.
Building the legend of Kvothe.
Yeah.
And all of his cool gear. I just don't think it makes for a really good story. I think that's going to, when that's the weight you have to carry as the second part of a trilogy, it's going to drag it down some. It just is.
But,
It's necessary, but it's going to drag it down. For the next category, people, these are some of the best developed characters I've ever read. There doesn't seem to be anybody in these books that hasn't been completely thought out, completely fleshed out beforehand. When you meet somebody new, I never get the sense that they're character fodder, that they're throwaway characters just to get us past a certain point in the story. I mean, these are well-rounded characters, even the smallest ones. I get the feeling you could tell a story from each and every single one of them's perspective. It might not be the same story that these books are about, but you could tell a story from all of their perspectives. And I gave it a 9.
I gave it a 9 too. For the same reasons, I felt like every character had something that made them them. There was something special about them. And I love to see, like, I agree, you could make a book out of a lot of these characters on its own. I really enjoyed seeing these characters throughout the book.
I think that's why I like the short stories too. Book 2.5 and the Bast story that was in a collection. If you haven't checked them out, definitely do. They're great.
I didn't even know that.
You listened to the Bast one in the car.
Oh, okay.
Lightning Thief. The Lightning Thief. Or is that Percy Jackson?
That's Percy Jackson.
So I think it might have something to do with lightning. All right.
We'll have to look it up.
Nah, you guys can look it up. For the second book, though, I gave characters an 8.5. The only reason for that, the only reason why I bumped it down a little bit is because Kvothe didn't really grow a lot. Like I said, it felt like he was checking boxes on his legend quest there to become a legend. And I didn't feel like he grew anywhere near as much as the first book. It could be that he just grew a ton in the first book. So in comparison, the second book, there wasn't a lot of growth. I marked it down just a little.
For the second book, I marked it down just a little bit, 8.5. I felt like there were some characters that I wasn't introduced or fell in love with as much as I did with some of the ones that were introduced in the first book. And so I kind of was like, let's move along.
I love Devi. I love Ari. Is it Ari?
Yuri?
Is it Yuri? I think it's Ari.
Ari? Okay.
It's book 2.5. She's got an entire novella to herself. And
she's amazing character.
I think I called her Yuri.
Yes, I think you did.
And then I listened to the audiobook, which is read by Patrick Rothfuss, and I think he's calling her Ari.
Oh.
Or something like that. So maybe I just screwed it up in my head, which I do
Ari.
all the time.
Okay.
Pacing. I gave the first book an 8.5. It had a good through line. It had a good kind of theme, which was survival. It didn't go slow enough that it lost me at any point. It didn't go too fast that it lost me either. I did enjoy it. It seemed like it moved along. I gave the second book a 7 just because, like I said, the pacing, you're gonna hurt the pacing when it's story, 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 without that kind of arc, that through line arc. I didn't see it at least.
I gave the first book a 7. I didn't know about the present time and then going back in the past time. And so it kind of threw me off and I couldn't get the rhythm of it. And it was just hard. I just felt like it was kind of hard to get into. Once I figured that out, by the second book, It
took you the whole first book to figure that out?
It did take me the whole first book. But I felt like he did that transition for the present and the past a lot better in the second book. For some reason, I felt like the breaks were so much smoother. So I enjoyed it better. And so I gave the pacing for the second book an 8 because I felt like it was smoother.
Pacing is going to get jarred when you're jumping in time. It's just a fact. Most of the time. So for prose, I gave both books a 9 out of 10. That's really high praise. The notes that I wrote down for it were, for book 1, I wrote, come on. For book 2, I wrote, come on. Seriously, I think Patrick Rothfuss is really known for his his prose. It is profound at times. It is very poetic. It's like you're reading a poem, even though you're not. He uses words like a painter uses paint.
I gave it a 9 too. I felt like it was very whimsical. When he would come up with his songs and writing, it was just almost beautiful and just made you feel more in love with the book and with the characters and things. So yes, I always thought of it as whimsical. This is my word.
He takes a long time to craft these books, and you can see the results of it in the prose, definitely. Place is the last category, or the world-building aspect of things. I gave the first book a 6 and the second book a 5.5. If there's anywhere that these books kind of fall short for me, in my personal preference, it's in those areas. I don't feel like I know this world very well. Everything's still shrouded in mystery, and I think that's intentional, but I don't necessarily enjoy that. I like having some mystery, but I feel like I know very little. When it comes to culture of certain groups, done very well. But when it comes to places, except for the town that's outside the university and the university itself, I can't tell one city from another. I'm not keeping track of all these things very well in my head, other than, okay, where are we now? They're not distinctive. They're not very distinctive. They do have some distinctive characteristics, but they're just not as well fleshed out. And maybe you only have so many pages, and he concentrates on people instead of places. The world may be great. It may, by the third book, get a huge bump in score for me. But for right now, they're the lowest of the scores for this book. For these two books.
I gave it a 7 for both books because some areas I thought he explained and described the place pretty well and it was laid out. And then some areas I couldn't visualize it. I couldn't figure out where we're at. But in the second book, I felt like he did the same. But the ones that we were familiar with, he kind of added on to. In that second book, like the university and the town nearby, I felt like we kind of got a little more understanding of the town and the university.
Yeah, I mean, in my head, I know there's a university. I know there's some dorms. I know there's a bridge between it and the town. I know Devi lives in an alley that stinks. I know certain things, but I really can't picture it. I think some authors do really well, or maybe even publishers, when they add maps and illustrations. Sometimes when things are so, and it's not so much for this book, but when things are so out of the ordinary and hard to picture, some of those things can help a lot. I'm not sure maps would help, honestly, for most of these things, but maybe a few sketch-like drawings that are artistic, and I think I read them on my Kindle, so I tend to skip past those things really fast on the Kindle. But if I had a paperback, it'd be different.
There was a map. I don't know. On the Kindle, I think I had read the actual book for one of them, and there was a map at the beginning that you could see the whole of the world, but it wasn't very detailed. I mean, I still had troubles with figuring out where things were because I don't think it had listed every town that they talked about on there.
I guess what I'm saying is when you only have so many words and you're explaining so many other things and you don't want to go into over-explaining an area or a place, there are some shortcuts that can be taken, and illustrations and maps and things of that nature are, when balanced and used well, can be a very good shortcut that helps the reader. All right, for overall scores, book 1 I gave it a 9, book 2 I gave it a 7.5. 7.5 is still a really good score. I still enjoyed the book. I would recommend reading it. I might recommend reading them when book 3 comes out, or is definitely coming out, has a solid... just wait till book 3 comes out. But book 1, one of the best entries into any any series I've ever read. Book 2, weaker second book. I want some momentum towards whatever the end goal is for each book. Some momentum. And I didn't feel like there was any real momentum to the second book. It felt like it was just legend building for Kvothe. And hey, that needs to happen, but it needs to happen in a way that forwards the story somewhat. I'm hoping that most of the story happens after the first 3 books.
For the first book, I gave it an 8. The second book, I gave it a 9. I felt like the first book, I had a little bit of trouble getting the pacing. I didn't feel like I was as connected with it as much as I was with the second one. Maybe the second one, I helped to further the characters on and their life stories, and I got really invested in the characters that I really loved. I felt like the second book gave you more of a connection to the present. We were connecting some of the mysteries and things that were going on that you see in the present at the tavern with these taverns.
Tavern. Sounds like you're staying in somebody's big shirt. Half tavern, half tavern. We're in the tavern now. Smells kind of sweaty.
Oh my.
Most taverns do too.
Well, yeah. We got to connect those two, kind of getting the pieces of this mystery of why he's where he is and what happened.